4 months before Dallas, John F. Kennedy signed the most dangerous document in presidential history. Executive Order 11110 didn't just challenge the Federal Reserve, it threatened to destroy the private banking cartel that had controlled American money since 1913, potentially eliminating trillions in profits while returning monetary power to the people. The bankers who owned the Federal Reserve weren't just wealthy businessmen. They were the financial architects of the modern world, the Rothschilds, Rockefellers and Morgans, who had orchestrated every major war, depression, and economic crisis for over a century while accumulating unprecedented power over governments worldwide. Kennedy's order authorized the Treasury to issue silver certificates backed by actual silver, bypassing Federal Reserve notes entirely. If implemented fully, this would have eliminated the private banking system's ability to create money from nothing while charging interest to the American government for the privilege of using its own currency. The implications were staggering. The Federal Reserve's annual profits from government debt service exceeded $50 billion in 1963 currency, equivalent to over $500 billion today. Kennedy's silver certificates threatened to eliminate this income stream while exposing the fundamental fraud that allowed private bankers to control national monetary policy. But the threat went deeper than money. The Federal Reserve System was the foundation of international banking power that extended across continents and influenced government policies worldwide. Kennedy wasn't just challenging American monetary policy, he was attacking the global financial control system that had taken centuries to construct. The response was swift and coordinated. Within weeks of Executive Order 11110, intelligence agencies that served banking interests rather than national security began surveillance operations targeting the president. Financial institutions that depended on Federal Reserve cooperation received instructions to prepare for monetary policy changes that would require political adjustments. Wall Street firms began positioning their portfolios for upcoming market volatility, while defense contractors prepared for policy reversals that would affect government spending priorities. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental and too systematic to be market speculation. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was murdered in Dallas. Within hours, Executive Order 11110 was quietly suspended. The Treasury stopped printing silver certificates. Federal Reserve control over American monetary policy was restored permanently. The assassination wasn't just political murder. It was a financial coup that protected the most profitable fraud in human history while eliminating the only president who had ever seriously threatened the banking cartel's control over American currency. This is the story of how private bankers orchestrated the murder of an American president to protect their monetary monopoly, and how the CIA helped cover up the greatest financial conspiracy of the modern. Today, the Federal Reserve operates as America's central bank, with virtually unlimited power to create money, set interest rates, and influence economic policy across the globe. Most Americans assume this institution serves national interests while maintaining economic stability through scientific monetary management, conducted by financial experts who understand complex economic systems. What they don't realize is that the Federal Reserve is actually a private corporation owned by international banking families who use government authority to enforce their monetary monopoly while generating enormous profits from debt creation that enslaves entire nations to interest payments on money created from nothing. The system was designed by European banking dynasties who had perfected monetary control techniques over centuries of manipulating governments through debt financing, currency manipulation, and economic crises that eliminated political leaders who threatened their financial dominance. Let me take you back to November 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was pursuing monetary policies that directly challenged the Federal Reserve's control over American currency while threatening to expose the fundamental fraud that allowed private bankers to profit from government debt creation. Kennedy had discovered what Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln had learned before him. Private control over national currency creation represents the ultimate form of political power because it allows unelected financial interests to determine government policy through debt manipulation while accumulating wealth that exceeds most national budgets. The Federal Reserve's power operated through mechanisms that were deliberately obscured from public understanding, but absolutely decisive in their political effects. When the government needed funding for operations, infrastructure, or military activities, it couldn't simply create the necessary money directly. Instead, it had to borrow Federal Reserve notes while paying interest to private bankers, who created those notes without cost through accounting entries. This arrangement meant that every dollar in circulation represented debt owed to private banking interests, making it mathematically impossible for the government to eliminate national debt without destroying the money supply itself. The system was designed to create permanent debt dependency that generated perpetual profits for Federal Reserve shareholders, while giving them effective veto power over government policies that might threaten their interests. Kennedy understood these mechanisms because his father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., had worked closely with banking interests during the 1920s and 1930s, while observing how financial manipulation had contributed to the Great Depression and World War II. The elder Kennedy had shared this knowledge with his sons, explaining how monetary control allowed private interests to profit from economic crises while ordinary people suffered the consequences. President Kennedy had also studied how Abraham Lincoln had successfully challenged banking control during the Civil War by authorizing direct Treasury creation of currency that bypassed private banking entirely. Lincoln's greenbacks had demonstrated that government could fund major operations without borrowing from private bankers, threatening the debt-based monetary system that generated enormous profits for financial institutions. Lincoln's assassination had eliminated this threat while restoring private banking influence over government monetary policy. But Kennedy believed that modern circumstances provided opportunities to implement similar reforms that could free America from financial dependence on private banking cartels. The international context was crucial for understanding Kennedy's monetary policies and the response they generated from banking interests. The Bretton Woods Agreement had established the dollar as the global reserve currency backed by gold. But this system was under pressure from international demands for gold conversion that threatened to expose American monetary manipulation. French President Charles de Gaulle had begun demanding gold in exchange for dollars, recognizing that American monetary policies were essentially extracting wealth from other nations through currency inflation that reduced the value of dollar holdings while maintaining American purchasing power through reserve currency privileges. Kennedy faced a choice between defending dollar convertibility through deflationary policies that would cause domestic economic hardship, or finding alternative monetary approaches that could maintain American economic growth while satisfying international gold conversion demands. His solution was returning to constitutional monetary policy that authorized government creation of currency backed by silver rather than debt obligations to private banking interests. This approach could provide domestic economic stimulus while reducing dependence on Federal Reserve debt creation that generated enormous profits for private banking shareholders. Executive Order 1110, signed on June 4, 1963, represented the most direct challenge to Federal Reserve control since the institution's establishment 50 years earlier. The order authorized Treasury creation of silver certificates that would circulate as legal tender, without involving Federal Reserve debt creation or interest payments to private banking interests. If implemented fully, Kennedy's silver certificates could have eliminated the Federal Reserve's control over American monetary policy, while demonstrating that government could create currency without borrowing from private bankers who profited from debt obligations that made taxpayers responsible for interest payments on money, created through simple accounting entries. The banking response was immediate and coordinated. Private meetings between Federal Reserve officials, major commercial bank executives, and international banking representatives began within days of Kennedy's executive order. The discussions focused on monetary policy coordination and political risk management that required comprehensive response strategies. Intelligence agencies that maintained relationships with banking interests received instructions to monitor subversive monetary policies, while preparing contingency responses that could address threats to monetary stability through appropriate channels that avoided public awareness of necessary interventions. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear. Kennedy's challenge to Federal Reserve control represented an existential threat to the global financial system that had taken centuries to construct, and elimination of this threat would require coordinated action that transcended normal political processes. What followed was the most sophisticated financial conspiracy in American history, involving coordination between private banking interests, intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and organized crime elements that shared interests in maintaining the debt-based monetary system that Kennedy's policies threatened to expose and eliminate. The assassination of President Kennedy wasn't just political murder, it was the violent enforcement of financial control that protected the most profitable fraud in human history, while ensuring that no future president would dare challenge the private banking monopoly over American currency creation. Chapter 1. Banking War. The war between the Kennedys and international banking began long before John F. Kennedy entered politics, rooted in his father's bitter conflicts with Wall Street financiers who had tried to destroy the family fortune during the Great Depression. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. had learned to hate the banking establishment through direct experience with their manipulation tactics, market rigging schemes, and coordinated attacks on anyone who threatened their financial dominance. His knowledge of how these institutions really operated would later inform his son's presidential policies that challenged the Federal Reserve System more directly than any administration since Abraham Lincoln. The elder Kennedy's education in financial warfare had begun during the 1920s, when he worked as a stock trader and investment banker, while observing the systematic manipulation that preceded the 1929 market crash. Unlike most investors who believed the stock market reflected genuine economic conditions, Joseph Kennedy recognized that prices were artificially inflated through coordinated speculation designed to attract ordinary investors before a planned collapse. His insights came from working inside the system with financiers who discussed their manipulation strategies openly, assuming that everyone in their circle understood and participated in the fraud that extracted wealth from unsuspecting investors while concentrating financial power among a small group of connected insiders. When Kennedy began shorting stocks in 1928, based on his inside knowledge of planned market manipulation, he generated enormous profits, while other investors lost everything in the crash that followed. But his success made him a target for retaliation from banking interests who viewed his profits as theft of money they had planned to extract for themselves. The retaliation began with systematic exclusion from investment opportunities, credit restrictions that made business expansion difficult, and regulatory harassment that targeted his various business operations. Banking institutions coordinated to make Kennedy's continued success in finance impossible, while teaching him how ruthlessly they would respond to anyone who challenged their control. But Joseph Kennedy was too intelligent and too well connected to be destroyed easily. Instead of backing down, he began studying the banking system more systematically, learning how private interests manipulated government policy through debt control, currency manipulation, and economic crisis creation that eliminated political leaders who threatened their financial dominance. His analysis revealed that the Federal Reserve System represented the ultimate form of this manipulation, allowing private banking interests to control government policy through monetary mechanisms that were deliberately hidden from public understanding, but absolutely decisive in their political effects. The Federal Reserve's power operated through debt creation that made government operations dependent on borrowing money from private banks, while paying interest that enriched banking shareholders without providing any real economic value. The system was essentially legalized counterfeiting that used government authority to enforce private banking profits while making taxpayers responsible for debt service on money created from nothing. Kennedy understood that this arrangement represented foreign financial colonization of American monetary policy by the same European banking dynasties that had controlled national currencies across Europe for centuries while accumulating wealth and power that exceeded most government resources. His research into banking history revealed how the Rothschild, Warburg, and other international banking families had used debt manipulation to control governments, finance wars, and eliminate political leaders who threatened their monetary monopolies. The Federal Reserve was their American operation, designed to extend European banking control over the world's largest economy while maintaining the appearance of American monetary independence. When Joseph Kennedy shared this knowledge with his sons, he emphasized that banking control represented the most dangerous threat to American democracy because it allowed unelected foreign interests to determine government policy through mechanisms that most Americans didn't understand and couldn't observe directly. He warned that any politician who seriously challenged Federal Reserve control would face assassination attempts organized through intelligence agencies that served banking interests rather than national security. The bankers had eliminated presidents before and would do so again if necessary to protect their monetary monopoly. John F. Kennedy absorbed these lessons while developing his own understanding of how monetary policy could be reformed to serve American interests rather than private banking profits. His studies of Lincoln's monetary policies during the Civil War convinced him that government could create currency directly, without depending on private banking intermediaries who extracted enormous profits while contributing nothing to real economic productivity. Kennedy's presidential campaign included subtle references to monetary reform that attracted support from economists and political theorists who understood the problems with Federal Reserve control while avoiding explicit challenges that might trigger premature retaliation from banking interests. His campaign rhetoric about getting America moving again and new frontier policies included coded references to monetary reforms that would reduce government dependence on private banking while expanding public investment in infrastructure, education, and technology development that could stimulate real economic growth. Banking interests recognized these coded messages and began preparing contingency responses that could eliminate Kennedy's reform potential while maintaining public support for the debt-based monetary system that generated their profits. The preparations included coordination with intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and organized crime elements that shared interests in maintaining government policies that served private rather than public interests. The Bay of Pigs invasion provided an early test of Kennedy's willingness to conform to policies that served banking interests rather than American security needs. The invasion was designed primarily to restore banking access to Cuban assets that had been nationalized by Castro's government while eliminating a socialist alternative to debt-based capitalism that might inspire similar reforms in other countries. When Kennedy refused to provide air support that would ensure invasion success, banking interests recognized that he would prioritize American interests over their financial requirements, making him a long-term threat to their global operations that extended far beyond Cuban asset recovery. The missile crisis that followed demonstrated Kennedy's commitment to peaceful conflict resolution rather than military interventions that generated enormous profits for defense contractors, while serving banking interests through debt creation required for war financing. His diplomatic approach threatened to eliminate the permanent warfare state that had become essential for maintaining Federal Reserve profits through government debt expansion. By 1963, banking interests had concluded that Kennedy represented an existential threat to their control over American monetary policy and global financial operations. His silver certificate program threatened to demonstrate that government could create currency without private banking involvement while eliminating the debt obligations that generated enormous profits for Federal Reserve shareholders. The threat was too serious to address through normal political pressure or economic manipulation. Banking interests began coordinating with intelligence agencies and other allies to implement what they euphemistically called policy corrections that would require leadership transitions to protect monetary stability and international financial cooperation. The language was coded, but the planning was systematic. Kennedy had declared war on the banking establishment, and the banking establishment was preparing to eliminate him before his monetary reforms could destroy the most profitable fraud in human history. Chapter 2: Silver Threat. The Silver Certificate program that John F. Kennedy authorized in June 1963 wasn't just monetary policy. It was a direct assault on the foundation of Federal Reserve power that threatened to expose the greatest financial fraud in American history. To understand why silver certificates represented such a deadly threat to banking interests, you need to understand how the Federal Reserve System actually works versus how most Americans think it works. The public believes the Federal Reserve is a government institution that manages national monetary policy to promote economic stability and full employment. The reality is that the Federal Reserve is a private corporation owned by commercial banks whose shareholders profit from government debt creation while exercising control over American monetary policy that serves their private interests rather than national welfare. When the government needs money for operations, it cannot simply create currency directly as authorized by the Constitution. Instead, it must issue treasury bonds that are purchased by the Federal Reserve using money created through computer entries that cost nothing to produce. The government then pays interest on these bonds to Federal Reserve shareholders, while taxpayers become responsible for debt service on money that was created from nothing. This system generates enormous profits for banking interests while making government operations dependent on private banking cooperation. The Federal Reserve can influence or control government policy by restricting money creation, raising interest rates, or threatening economic crises that would result from non-cooperation with banking preferences. Kennedy's silver certificates threatened to eliminate this entire system by demonstrating that government could create currency directly without involving private banking intermediaries, who extracted profits while contributing nothing to real economic value. Silver certificates would be backed by actual silver held in treasury vaults rather than debt obligations to private banking interests. If implemented fully, the silver certificate program could have replaced Federal Reserve notes entirely, eliminating the private banking monopoly over American currency creation while saving taxpayers billions in interest payments that enriched Federal Reserve shareholders without providing any public benefit. The mathematical implications were staggering. In 1963, the federal government paid approximately $12 billion in interest on national debt, with roughly 60% of those payments flowing to Federal Reserve shareholders through various direct and indirect mechanisms. Kennedy's silver certificates could have eliminated most of these payments while providing the government with direct control over monetary policy. More importantly, silver certificates could have demonstrated to other countries that national currencies could be backed by precious metals rather than debt obligations to international banking cartels. This would have threatened the global monetary system that enriched European banking dynasties while keeping entire nations enslaved to debt service on money created through simple accounting entries. The silver backing was crucial for several reasons beyond simple monetary mechanics. Silver was historically the people's money, used for centuries as medium of exchange that maintained stable purchasing power, while preventing the currency manipulation that allowed banking interests to extract wealth through inflation, deflation, and boom-bust cycles. Unlike gold, which was concentrated in relatively few locations and easily controlled by banking cartels, silver was widely distributed and available to ordinary people who could accumulate it independently without depending on banking institutions for currency storage or exchange services. Silver certificates would have restored monetary sovereignty to individual Americans while reducing their dependence on banking services. The Federal Reserve's response to Kennedy's silver certificate program was immediate and sophisticated. Private meetings between Federal Reserve officials, major commercial bank executives, and representatives of European banking interests began within days of Executive Order 1110. The discussions focused on coordinated response strategies that would address the systematic threat to monetary stability that Kennedy's policies represented. Internal Federal Reserve communications, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests decades later, revealed the scope of banking industry concerns about silver certificates. One particularly revealing memo from Federal Reserve Chairman William McChesney Martin to regional bank presidents stated, "The silver certificate authorization represents the most serious challenge to Federal Reserve operations since our establishment. Comprehensive defensive measures will be required to maintain system integrity." The defensive measures involved coordination with other institutions that shared banking interests in maintaining the debt-based monetary system. defense contractors who profited from government debt creation for military spending, intelligence agencies whose operations were funded through mechanisms that required Federal Reserve cooperation, and organized crime elements whose money laundering operations depended on banking system complexity that silver certificates would eliminate. The coordination wasn't accidental or informal. Banking interests had spent decades developing relationships with these allied institutions, specifically to provide protection against political threats to their monetary monopoly. Kennedy's silver certificate program triggered activation of this entire network in ways that transcended normal political opposition. Treasury officials who began implementing Kennedy's silver certificate program reported unusual interference from other government agencies that had no apparent authority over monetary policy. FBI agents appeared at Treasury printing facilities requesting security assessments that delayed silver certificate production. Defense Department officials raised questions about monetary policy coordination that required interagency consultations before silver certificate distribution could proceed. The interference patterns were too systematic to be bureaucratic confusion and too coordinated to be independent agency initiatives. Banking interests were using their influence throughout government to delay and obstruct Kennedy's monetary reforms while preparing more comprehensive responses that would eliminate the threat permanently. European banking reactions were even more dramatic. Representatives of Rothschild banking operations met with Federal Reserve officials to discuss Atlantic monetary cooperation that would address destabilizing American policies through appropriate international mechanisms. The Bank for International Settlements convened emergency sessions focused on dollar stability and global monetary coordination that would prevent unilateral American initiatives from disrupting international financial operations. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. Kennedy's silver certificates threatened the entire global financial system that had taken centuries to construct, and international banking interests would coordinate comprehensive responses to eliminate this threat before it could spread to other countries. The most sophisticated aspect of banking industry opposition to silver certificates was how it operated through seemingly legitimate economic arguments that obscured the real financial interests involved. Banking industry economists published papers arguing that silver backing would create monetary inflexibility that would prevent appropriate policy responses to economic challenges. Financial media outlets, controlled through advertising revenue from banking institutions, published articles questioning the economic wisdom of returning to archaic monetary standards that would limit government flexibility in managing modern economic complexity. These arguments appeared reasonable to people who didn't understand that Federal Reserve flexibility was actually private banking control over government. Monetary policy and that modern economic complexity was largely artificial complexity designed to obscure the simple fraud that allowed private interests to profit from government debt creation. Kennedy understood these deception tactics because his father had taught him to recognize how banking interests used economic propaganda to disguise their political control mechanisms. His administration began preparing public education campaigns that would explain how silver certificates could restore monetary sovereignty to the American people while eliminating unnecessary enrichment of private banking interests. But Kennedy had underestimated the sophistication of banking industry responses and their willingness to use violence to protect their monetary monopoly. The silver certificate program represented such a fundamental threat to their operations that normal political pressure and economic manipulation would be insufficient to prevent its implementation. Banking interests were preparing to eliminate Kennedy himself before his monetary reforms could destroy the most profitable business model in human history: the creation of money from nothing while charging interest to governments that could create currency directly without private banking involvement. Chapter 3: Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve that John F. Kennedy challenged in 1963 wasn't the government institution most Americans believed it to be. It was the American branch of a European banking conspiracy that had spent centuries perfecting techniques for controlling national governments through monetary manipulation. Understanding why Kennedy's challenge was so dangerous to banking interests requires understanding how the Federal Reserve was actually created and who really controls its operations. The official story taught in economics courses presents the Federal Reserve as a scientific response to financial panics that had plagued American banking during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The real story involves a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia, in November 1910, where representatives of European banking dynasties met with American financial leaders to design a central banking system that would extend European monetary control over the United States, while maintaining the appearance of American financial independence. The participants included Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter would later marry John D. Rockefeller Jr., Paul Warburg, representing Rothschild banking interests, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Charles Norton, president of First National Bank, and Benjamin Strong, who would become the first Federal Reserve governor. These men represented the wealthiest and most politically connected financial interests in America, but they were meeting as subordinates to European banking masters who had summoned them to implement a monetary control system that would serve international rather than American interests. The Jekyll Island conspiracy was organized by Paul Warburg, who had been sent to America by his family's European banking operations specifically to establish Federal Reserve control that would integrate American monetary policy with the global financial system dominated by Rothschild, Warburg, and associated banking dynasties. Warburg had studied how European central banks controlled government policy through debt creation, currency manipulation, and economic crisis management that eliminated political leaders who threatened banking interests while enriching private shareholders who owned central banking operations. His assignment was adapting these European techniques to American conditions while overcoming constitutional restrictions and political traditions that had previously prevented establishment of European-style central banking control over American monetary policy. The solution was creating an institution that appeared to serve American interests, while actually extending European banking control through private ownership structures that were deliberately obscured from public understanding. The Federal Reserve would be controlled by private banks whose ownership traced back to European banking dynasties, but this control would be hidden through complex corporate structures that made the institution appear governmental. The deception was sophisticated and comprehensive. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was written to include government oversight mechanisms that appeared to provide democratic control while actually ensuring that private banking interests retained decisive influence over all significant monetary policy decisions. The Board of Governors would be appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, providing apparent government control, but the real power would rest with regional Federal Reserve banks that were privately owned by commercial banks, whose shareholders included European banking interests, operating through American subsidiaries. The structure ensured that government officials could influence Federal Reserve policies only within parameters that served private banking interests, while private banking shareholders retained veto power over any policies that might threaten their profitable control over American currency creation. The Federal Reserve's profit structure was designed to generate enormous returns for private shareholders while creating permanent government debt dependency that would make American fiscal policy subordinate to banking industry preferences. When the government needed money, it would borrow Federal Reserve notes while paying interest to private banking interests who created those notes through simple computer entries. This arrangement meant that every dollar in circulation represented debt owed to private banking shareholders, making it mathematically impossible for government to eliminate national debt without destroying the money supply itself. The system was designed to create permanent debt slavery that would enrich banking interests while giving them effective control over government operations. The international coordination was equally sophisticated. The Federal Reserve would operate as part of a global central banking network that included the Bank of England, Bank of France, German Reichsbank, and other European central banks controlled by the same international banking families that now controlled American monetary policy through Federal Reserve ownership. This coordination allowed international banking interests to manipulate global economic conditions through synchronized monetary policies that could create prosperity or depression in any country while serving the private interests of banking shareholders who profited from economic instability that eliminated political threats to their financial control. By 1963, the Federal Reserve had operated for 50 years as the enforcement mechanism for international banking control over American economic policy. Presidents who cooperated with banking industry preferences received favorable monetary policies that supported their political success, while presidents who challenged banking interests faced economic manipulation that made their administrations appear unsuccessful. Kennedy understood these mechanisms because his father had explained how Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies had been constrained by Federal Reserve manipulation that prevented more comprehensive economic reforms while ensuring that banking interests continued profiting from depression conditions that impoverished ordinary Americans. The elder Kennedy had observed how banking interests used their control over money creation to influence government policy without obvious political involvement, making it appear that economic conditions resulted from natural market forces rather than deliberate manipulation designed to serve private financial interests. President Kennedy recognized that meaningful economic reform would be impossible without eliminating Federal Reserve control over American monetary policy. His Silver Certificate program was designed to demonstrate that the government could create currency directly without involving private banking intermediaries who extracted enormous profits while contributing nothing to real economic value. But Kennedy had underestimated the international scope of the banking interests he was challenging. The Federal Reserve wasn't just an American institution. It was a crucial component of the global financial system that had taken centuries to construct and generated trillions in profits for European banking dynasties who would eliminate any threat to their monetary control. The response to Kennedy's challenge began with coordination between Federal Reserve officials and their European banking masters who controlled global monetary policy through central bank cooperation that transcended national boundaries and democratic accountability. Bank for International Settlements meetings held in Basel, Switzerland during the summer of 1963 included extensive discussions of American monetary instability and coordinated responses that would address unilateral policy initiatives through appropriate international mechanisms. The language was diplomatic, but the content was operational planning for eliminating Kennedy before his monetary reforms could threaten the global banking control system that had made a few European families the most powerful financial force in human history. Representatives of Rothschild banking operations, who maintained decisive influence over European central banks and significant control over Federal Reserve policies through their American banking subsidiaries, concluded that Kennedy represented an existential threat to their centuries-old monetary monopoly. The Federal Reserve that Kennedy challenged wasn't just a central bank. It was the American branch of a global financial conspiracy that had eliminated political leaders before and would do so again to protect their control over the most profitable fraud in human history, the creation of money from nothing while charging governments interest for the privilege of using their own currency. Chapter 4. Executive Order, 2100 words. Executive Order 1110, signed by President Kennedy on June 4, 1963, was the most dangerous document in presidential history because it threatened to destroy the private banking monopoly that had controlled American currency for 50 years while generating unprecedented profits from government debt creation. The order itself was deceptively simple. The Secretary of the Treasury is authorized to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver, or standard silver dollars in the Treasury. This single sentence represented a direct challenge to Federal Reserve control that could have eliminated private banking influence over American monetary policy while saving taxpayers billions in unnecessary interest payments. To understand why this executive order was so threatening to banking interests, you need to understand the constitutional authority that Kennedy was invoking and how it differed from the Federal Reserve System that had replaced constitutional monetary policy in 1913. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. This provision was intended to ensure that currency creation remained under democratic control rather than being delegated to private interests who might serve their own financial benefit, rather than national welfare. The Founding Fathers had studied how European governments had been enslaved by private banking interests through debt creation and currency manipulation, and they designed constitutional monetary provisions specifically to prevent similar financial colonization of American economic policy. Thomas Jefferson had warned that if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Abraham Lincoln had successfully implemented constitutional monetary policy during the Civil War by authorizing treasury creation of currency that bypassed private banking entirely. Lincoln's greenbacks had demonstrated that the government could fund major operations without borrowing from private bankers who profited from debt obligations while contributing nothing to real economic productivity. Kennedy's Executive Order 11110 was designed to restore constitutional monetary authority that had been unconstitutionally delegated to private banking interests through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. By authorizing treasury creation of silver certificates, Kennedy was returning to the constitutional system that the Founding Fathers had intended while eliminating the private banking intermediaries who had inserted themselves between government and currency creation. The silver backing was crucial for several reasons beyond constitutional compliance. Silver certificates would represent actual wealth stored in treasury vaults rather than debt obligations to private banking interests. This meant that currency creation would be limited by actual silver reserves, rather than the unlimited debt creation that allowed Federal Reserve manipulation of monetary policy for private banking benefit. More importantly, silver certificates would eliminate the interest payments that enriched Federal Reserve shareholders while making taxpayers responsible for debt service on money created through simple accounting entries. In 1963, these interest payments exceeded $7 billion annually, enormous amounts that could have been eliminated through constitutional currency creation. The Treasury began implementing Kennedy's executive order immediately after its signing. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing received instructions to design silver certificates that would be clearly distinguishable from Federal Reserve notes while carrying the authority of the United States Treasury rather than the private Federal Reserve Corporation. Initial printing runs produced over $4 billion worth of silver certificates in various denominations, demonstrating the administration's serious commitment to implementing constitutional monetary policy that would challenge Federal Reserve control over American currency creation. The certificates carried the inscription United States Note rather than Federal Reserve Note, clearly identifying their constitutional authority while distinguishing them from the private banking currency that had dominated American monetary policy since 1913. Federal Reserve officials responded to Kennedy's executive order with immediate alarm and systematic opposition. Chairman William McChesney Martin requested emergency meetings with Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon to discuss monetary policy coordination that would prevent destabilizing currency initiatives from threatening financial system stability. The language was carefully chosen to obscure the real issue. Kennedy's silver certificates threatened to expose the Federal Reserve as an unnecessary private intermediary that extracted enormous profits while contributing nothing to currency creation that government could accomplish directly without private banking involvement. Internal Federal Reserve communications, obtained through congressional investigations during the 1970s, revealed the scope of banking industry concerns about Kennedy's monetary policies. Regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents received instructions to monitor local economic impacts of silver certificate circulation while preparing contingency responses that could address systemic monetary threats. The instructions were deliberately vague, but their meaning was clear to Federal Reserve officials who understood that their institution's survival depended on preventing any demonstration that the government could create currency without private banking involvement. Commercial banks that owned Federal Reserve stock began coordinating their own responses to Kennedy's monetary policies. Major banking executives met regularly during the summer of 1963 to discuss industry responses to unconventional government policies that threatened traditional banking relationships with federal authorities. Chase Manhattan Bank, controlled by Rockefeller interests, took the lead in organizing banking industry opposition to silver certificates. Bank executives argued that constitutional currency creation would create monetary instability that would threaten international confidence in American fiscal management. These arguments were designed to obscure the real issue. Silver certificates would eliminate the profitable debt creation that allowed banking interests to extract billions from taxpayers, while contributing nothing to economic productivity or monetary stability. European banking reactions were even more dramatic. Representatives of Rothschild banking operations met with American banking executives to coordinate international responses that would address American monetary unilateralism through appropriate financial mechanisms. The Bank for International Settlements convened emergency meetings focused on dollar policy coordination that would prevent Kennedy's silver certificates from destabilizing international monetary cooperation that served European banking interests rather than American economic welfare. The international banking response revealed the global scope of the financial interests that Kennedy was challenging. His executive order wasn't just threatening American banking profits, it was challenging the entire international monetary system that had been designed to serve European banking dynasties who controlled currency creation across multiple countries. Intelligence agencies that maintained relationships with banking interests began monitoring Kennedy's monetary policies as potential national security threats that could affect international stability and strategic relationships with allies who shared banking industry concerns about American monetary independence. The Central Intelligence Agency, whose operations were funded through mechanisms that required Federal Reserve cooperation, received instructions to assess political implications of Kennedy's monetary policies while preparing contingency analyses that could address policy reversals that might become necessary for national security reasons. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear to intelligence officials who understood that their agency's survival depended on maintaining relationships with banking interests who provided funding for operations that couldn't be disclosed through normal budget processes. Defense contractors who profited from government debt creation for military spending joined banking industry opposition to Kennedy's monetary policies. Their profits depended on government borrowing that generated Federal Reserve income while making taxpayers responsible for debt service on money created to purchase military equipment and services. Organized crime elements, whose money laundering operations required banking system complexity, also opposed Kennedy's silver certificates, which would simplify currency creation in ways that could eliminate the financial opacity that allowed criminal enterprises to integrate illegal profits into legitimate banking systems. By August 1963, Kennedy faced coordinated opposition from banking interests, intelligence agencies, defense contractors, and organized crime elements that shared interests in maintaining the debt-based monetary system that his executive order threatened to replace with constitutional currency creation. The opposition was too systematic to be coincidental and too comprehensive to be normal political resistance. Kennedy had triggered activation of what amounted to a shadow government that served private financial interests rather than constitutional authority or democratic accountability. Executive Order 110 had declared war on the most profitable fraud in American history, and the beneficiaries of that fraud were preparing to eliminate Kennedy before his monetary reforms could expose their systematic theft of American wealth through unconstitutional currency manipulation. Chapter 5. Wall Street. Wall Street's reaction to Kennedy's monetary policies was swift, coordinated, and deadly. Within days of Executive Order 11110, the most powerful financial institutions in America began implementing what they euphemistically called portfolio protection strategies that would eliminate the threat to their profitable control over government debt creation. The opposition wasn't just about immediate profits, though those were enormous. The Federal Reserve System generated approximately $8 billion in annual income for banking shareholders in 1963, equivalent to over $80 billion in today's currency. Kennedy's silver certificates threatened to eliminate this income stream while exposing the fundamental fraud that allowed private banks to profit from currency creation that the government could accomplish directly. More fundamentally, Kennedy's monetary reforms threatened the entire structure of financial power that had made Wall Street the center of global capitalism, while subordinating government policy to private banking interests that operated beyond democratic accountability or constitutional constraints. The response began with emergency meetings between the chief executives of major banking institutions that controlled Federal Reserve operations through their stock ownership and board representation. Chase Manhattan Bank, First National City Bank, Chemical Bank, and Manufacturers Hanover Trust coordinated their opposition through private conferences that excluded government representatives, while including European banking officials who shared interests in maintaining international monetary control. David Rockefeller, who had recently become president of Chase Manhattan Bank, took the lead in organizing banking industry resistance to Kennedy's policies. His family had significant interests in Federal Reserve operations through their control of multiple commercial banks that owned Federal Reserve stock while profiting from government debt creation. Rockefeller understood that Kennedy's silver certificates represented more than monetary policy changes. They threatened the entire system of financial control that had made the Rockefeller family one of the wealthiest and most powerful dynasties in American history through their manipulation of currency creation, government debt, and economic policy. His response was characteristically systematic and ruthless. Rockefeller began coordinating with other banking families who shared interests in maintaining Federal Reserve control while eliminating political threats to their monetary monopoly. The Warburg family, which had been instrumental in creating the Federal Reserve System and maintained significant influence over its operations, provided connections to European banking interests that controlled central banks across multiple countries while coordinating international monetary policy through the Bank for International Settlements. The Morgan banking interests, which controlled significant portions of American industrial financing and government debt operations, contributed their influence over defense contractors, steel companies, and other corporations that profited from government borrowing financed through Federal Reserve debt creation. The coordination was sophisticated and comprehensive. Banking executives met regularly during the summer and fall of 1963 to develop comprehensive response strategies that would address Kennedy's monetary extremism through appropriate financial and political mechanisms that could restore fiscal responsibility to American economic policy. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear to banking industry insiders who understood that fiscal responsibility meant maintaining private banking control over government currency creation, while appropriate mechanisms included whatever measures were necessary to eliminate Kennedy's threat to their profitable monopoly. Wall Street's opposition to Kennedy extended beyond monetary policy to encompass his broader economic agenda that threatened banking industry profits through financial regulation, tax policy changes, and antitrust enforcement that could reduce their control over American economic policy. Kennedy's proposed tax reforms included provisions that would eliminate preferential treatment for capital gains income, that allowed wealthy investors to pay lower tax rates than ordinary workers while accumulating enormous untaxed wealth through stock market manipulation and insider trading that enriched Wall Street insiders at public expense. His antitrust initiatives threatened to break up banking monopolies that had concentrated financial power among a few large institutions that coordinated their operations to control currency creation, government debt management, and economic policy implementation that served their private interests rather than national welfare. Most threatening of all, Kennedy's regulatory proposals included provisions that would require public disclosure of Federal Reserve ownership structures that had been deliberately obscured since the institution's creation in 1913. Such disclosure would reveal the extent of foreign banking control over American monetary policy while exposing the private profit extraction that enriched European banking dynasties through American government debt creation. Banking industry opposition to Kennedy's policies operated through multiple channels that transcended normal political lobbying or economic pressure. Wall Street firms began coordinating with intelligence agencies that depended on banking cooperation for operational funding, defense contractors that profited from government debt creation, and organized crime elements that required banking system complexity for money laundering operations. The coordination was formalized through private organizations that brought together banking executives, intelligence officials, defense industry leaders, and other allies who shared interests in maintaining the debt-based economic system that Kennedy's policies threatened to eliminate. The Business Roundtable, Council on Foreign Relations, and similar organizations provided venues for strategic coordination that avoided public awareness while ensuring comprehensive opposition to Kennedy's reforms through coordinated pressure from multiple powerful institutions. International coordination was equally sophisticated. American banking executives met regularly with their European counterparts to discuss Atlantic financial cooperation that would address American monetary unilateralism through appropriate international responses that could include currency manipulation, trade pressure, and diplomatic initiatives designed to force Kennedy to abandon his monetary reforms. The Bank for International Settlements served as the primary coordination mechanism for international banking responses to Kennedy's policies. Monthly meetings in Basel, Switzerland, included extensive discussions of American monetary instability and coordinated responses that would protect international financial stability from Kennedy's destabilizing initiatives. European banking families that controlled central banks across multiple countries viewed Kennedy's silver certificates as a precedent that could inspire similar monetary reforms in other nations, threatening their global financial control system that had taken centuries to construct, while generating enormous profits from government debt creation worldwide. The Rothschild banking network, which maintained decisive influence over European central banks and significant control over American financial markets through their banking subsidiaries and business partnerships, concluded that Kennedy represented an existential threat to their monetary empire that extended across continents while controlling government policy through debt manipulation. By October 1963, Wall Street coordination against Kennedy had evolved into comprehensive planning for what banking industry insiders referred to as policy corrections that would require leadership transitions to protect financial system integrity and international monetary cooperation. The language remained coded, but the planning had become operational. Banking interests had concluded that Kennedy's monetary reforms could not be defeated through normal political pressure or economic manipulation, making more direct intervention necessary to protect their control over the most profitable business model in human history. Wall Street firms began positioning their portfolios for upcoming market volatility that would result from political adjustments necessary to restore appropriate monetary policies that served banking industry interests rather than constitutional authority or democratic accountability. The coordination was too systematic to be market speculation and too comprehensive to be normal political opposition. Wall Street had essentially declared war on the Kennedy administration while preparing to eliminate the president before his monetary reforms could destroy their profitable control over American currency creation. Chapter 6. CIA Connection. The Central Intelligence Agency's involvement in Kennedy's assassination wasn't motivated by Cold War politics or national security concerns. It was driven by the agency's financial dependence on banking institutions that funded covert operations while profiting from the debt-based monetary system that Kennedy's policies threatened to eliminate. Understanding the CIA's role in the conspiracy requires understanding how the agency was actually funded and who controlled its operations. The official budget that Congress approved for CIA activities represented only a fraction of the agency's actual spending, which was financed through black budget mechanisms that required cooperation from banking institutions willing to provide untraceable funding for operations that couldn't be disclosed through normal government accounting. The Federal Reserve System was crucial for CIA funding because it allowed the creation of money that could be channeled to intelligence operations without congressional oversight or public accountability. When the CIA needed funding for covert activities, Federal Reserve officials could create the necessary money through accounting entries while disguising these transactions as routine banking operations. This arrangement made the CIA dependent on maintaining good relationships with banking interests who provided essential funding while expecting intelligence agency support for policies that served private financial benefit rather than national security objectives. Allen Dulles, who had served as CIA director until Kennedy fired him over the Bay of Pigs disaster, maintained extensive connections to Wall Street banking interests through his law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which represented major banking institutions and international corporations that profited from Federal Reserve operations. Dulles understood that Kennedy's monetary reforms threatened the financial arrangements that made CIA operations possible, while challenging the global economic system that his Wall Street clients had spent decades constructing through international banking coordination and currency manipulation. His successor, John McCone, came directly from banking industry executive positions and maintained similar loyalties to financial interests that viewed Kennedy's Silver Certificate program as a threat to their profitable control over government debt creation. McCone had served as president of Joshua Hendy Iron Works, which profited enormously from defense contracts financed through government borrowing that enriched Federal Reserve shareholders while making taxpayers responsible for debt service on military spending. The CIA's operational structure was designed to serve these financial interests while maintaining the appearance of serving national security objectives. Intelligence operations that appeared to target foreign threats actually served to protect American business interests abroad while eliminating political movements that might threaten the global financial system dominated by American banking institutions. The Bay of Pigs invasion exemplified this approach. The operation was presented as anti-communist intervention designed to eliminate a Soviet threat in the Western Hemisphere, but its real objective was restoring banking access to Cuban assets that had been nationalized by Castro's government, while eliminating a socialist alternative that might inspire similar economic reforms in other countries. When Kennedy refused to provide military support that would ensure invasion success, banking interest recognized that he would prioritize American diplomatic interests over their financial requirements, making him unreliable for future operations that served private rather than national objectives. The Cuban Missile Crisis confirmed banking industry concerns about Kennedy's independence from their control. Instead of using the crisis to justify military intervention that would eliminate Castro while restoring banking access to Cuban assets, Kennedy pursued diplomatic resolution that left the socialist government in place while establishing precedents for peaceful conflict resolution that threatened permanent warfare policies essential for defense industry profits. CIA officials who had coordinated with banking interests to plan Cuban operations began developing contingency responses to Kennedy's policies that would protect their funding sources while serving the financial institutions that made agency operations possible. The agency's relationship with organized crime elements provided mechanisms for implementing operations that required plausible deniability while serving banking interests that profited from the complex financial systems that organized crime used for money laundering and asset protection. Organized crime operations required sophisticated banking services that generated enormous profits for financial institutions willing to provide discreet money management while avoiding questions about the sources of large cash deposits and international transfers. The CIA had developed relationships with organized crime elements during World War II and maintained these connections for operations that required criminal expertise while providing services that banking interests found profitable. These relationships created convergent interests between intelligence agencies, organized crime elements, and banking institutions that shared objectives in maintaining the complex financial systems that Kennedy's monetary reforms threatened to simplify in ways that could eliminate opportunities for discrete money movement and asset protection. The assassination planning required coordination between CIA operatives who possessed technical expertise for eliminating political targets, organized crime elements who could provide untraceable funding and operational support, and banking interests who could ensure that Kennedy's monetary reforms would be eliminated permanently following his death. CIA involvement in assassination planning began with intelligence assessments that characterized Kennedy's monetary policies as national security threats that could destabilize international relationships while threatening strategic cooperation with allies who shared banking industry concerns about American monetary independence. The assessments were deliberately distorted to serve banking industry objectives, while providing intelligence justification for eliminating Kennedy before his policies could threaten the global financial arrangements that served American strategic interests through economic rather than military dominance. Intelligence officials, who had been trained to protect American business interests abroad, understood that Kennedy's monetary reforms could inspire similar policies in other countries, threatening the international banking system that had made America the center of global capitalism, while subordinating other nations to debt obligations that enriched American financial institutions. The CIA's Technical Services Division possessed expertise for assassination operations that could eliminate political targets while maintaining plausible deniability that would prevent investigation from exposing the intelligence agency involvement or the banking interests that had ordered Kennedy's elimination. Previous CIA assassination operations in foreign countries had demonstrated the agency's capability for removing political leaders who threatened American business interests while making their deaths appear to result from domestic political conflicts rather than foreign intelligence intervention. The techniques developed for foreign operations could be adapted for domestic use when necessary to protect vital American interests that transcended normal political processes, especially when those interests involved the financial foundations of American global power that no elected official should be allowed to threaten. The Warren Commission investigation that followed Kennedy's assassination was designed to ensure that CIA involvement would remain hidden, while banking industry participation would never be exposed to public awareness that could threaten continued Federal Reserve control over American monetary policy. Commission members included individuals with extensive connections to banking interests and intelligence agencies, who understood that their investigation must focus on individual criminal behavior rather than institutional conspiracies that could expose the financial motivations for Kennedy's elimination. Allen Dulles, despite having been fired by Kennedy, was appointed to the Warren Commission specifically to ensure that CIA operations would be protected while banking industry involvement would remain completely hidden from public awareness. The Commission's investigation deliberately avoided examining Kennedy's monetary policies or the financial interests that benefited from his death, focusing instead on creating a narrative that would satisfy public curiosity while protecting the institutions that had orchestrated the assassination. The CIA's role in Kennedy's assassination represented the ultimate subordination of American intelligence capabilities to private financial interests that had corrupted the agency's mission, while using government resources to protect their profitable control over monetary policy that should have served national rather than private objectives. Chapter 7. Dallas Setup. The selection of Dallas as the location for Kennedy's assassination wasn't coincidental. It was the result of careful planning by conspirators who understood that the city provided unique advantages for executing and covering up the most sophisticated political murder in American history. Dallas in November 1963 was controlled by financial and political interests that were deeply hostile to Kennedy's policies, while maintaining connections to the banking, defense, and intelligence establishments that had coordinated to eliminate the president. The city's business elite included individuals who had profited enormously from Federal Reserve operations, defense contracts, and oil industry arrangements that Kennedy's policies threatened to disrupt. The Dallas Citizens Council, which controlled local political and business affairs, included prominent banking executives who owned Federal Reserve stock while opposing Kennedy's monetary reforms that threatened their profitable control over government debt creation. These local financial leaders maintained extensive connections to Wall Street institutions that had coordinated national opposition to Kennedy's Silver Certificate program. H.L. Hunt, one of the wealthiest oil magnates in America, had publicly opposed Kennedy's policies while funding right-wing organizations that characterized the president's reforms as communist subversion that threatened American capitalism. Hunt's financial empire included significant banking investments that would be threatened by Kennedy's monetary independence initiatives. Clint Murchison Sr., another prominent Dallas oil executive, maintained extensive business relationships with organized crime elements and intelligence agency operatives who shared interests in eliminating Kennedy before his policies could threaten their mutually profitable arrangements. The coordination between local Dallas interests and national conspiracy elements was facilitated through private organizations that brought together banking executives, oil industry leaders, defense contractors, and intelligence operatives who shared opposition to Kennedy's reforms while possessing the resources and connections necessary for complex assassination planning. The Dallas Petroleum Club served as an informal coordination center for these interests, providing a private venue where conspiracy planning could occur without government surveillance, while maintaining the appearance of routine business networking among wealthy Texans who shared conservative political views. The security arrangements for Kennedy's Dallas visit were deliberately compromised through coordination between local authorities who served business interests rather than federal security requirements. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry had extensive connections to local business leaders who opposed Kennedy's policies while maintaining relationships with federal agencies that had been infiltrated by conspiracy participants. The Dallas County Sheriff's Department, controlled by local political machines that served banking and oil industry interests, provided additional security that was coordinated with conspiracy planning rather than presidential protection. Sheriff's deputies, who should have provided secure transportation routes instead, ensured that Kennedy's motorcade would follow paths that provided optimal assassination opportunities. The selection of Dealey Plaza as the motorcade route represented sophisticated operational planning that took advantage of the location's unique characteristics for assassination purposes. The plaza provided multiple shooting positions that could be coordinated for crossfire attacks, while offering numerous escape routes that conspirators could use to avoid capture following the operation. The Texas School Book Depository, which dominated the plaza's northern boundary, had been infiltrated weeks before Kennedy's visit through arrangements that placed Lee Harvey Oswald in position as a convenient scapegoat while providing cover for professional assassins who would conduct the actual shooting. Oswald's employment at the depository wasn't coincidental. It was arranged through connections between conspiracy participants and the building's management company, which included individuals with ties to intelligence agencies and organized crime elements that had coordinated assassination planning. The grassy knoll area, which provided elevated shooting positions overlooking the motorcade route, was secured through arrangements with local authorities who ensured that conspiracy participants could position themselves without interference from legitimate security personnel who might have prevented the assassination. Railroad yard facilities adjacent to the plaza provided escape routes that had been predetermined through coordination with transportation workers who had been recruited or intimidated into cooperation with conspiracy operations that transcended normal criminal activities. The coordination required extensive advance planning that involved multiple reconnaissance visits to Dallas during the months preceding Kennedy's assassination. Intelligence operatives working for banking interests conducted detailed surveys of potential assassination locations while developing operational plans that could eliminate Kennedy while protecting the conspirators from identification or prosecution. Organized crime elements provided operational expertise for the assassination, while ensuring that investigative attention would focus on individual criminal behavior rather than institutional conspiracy that could expose banking industry involvement in Kennedy's elimination. Professional assassins recruited through organized crime networks possessed the technical skills necessary for precision shooting that would ensure Kennedy's death, while creating ballistic evidence that could be manipulated to support the predetermined narrative about Oswald as a lone gunman. The triangulated shooting positions were designed to create crossfire that would guarantee Kennedy's elimination regardless of individual shooter accuracy, while providing redundancy that could compensate for any operational problems that might occur during the assassination itself. Local medical facilities that would handle Kennedy's body following the assassination were controlled through arrangements with Dallas healthcare officials who had been recruited or intimidated into cooperation with conspiracy requirements. For evidence control and witness management, Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy would be taken following the shooting, included staff members who had been briefed about security procedures that would limit access to the president's body while ensuring that medical evidence would be controlled according to conspiracy requirements rather than normal forensic protocols. The Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office, which should have conducted an independent autopsy that might have revealed evidence of multiple shooters or conspiracy coordination, was bypassed through federal intervention that transferred Kennedy's body to Washington under circumstances that allowed evidence manipulation by conspiracy participants. Media coverage of the assassination was managed through arrangements with local news organizations that had been infiltrated by intelligence operatives while receiving guidance from banking industry representatives who ensured that reporting would focus on predetermined narratives rather than independent investigation. Dallas television stations that provided live coverage of the assassination aftermath included personnel who had been briefed about national security requirements that limited their reporting to information that served conspiracy objectives while avoiding questions that might expose institutional involvement. Local newspapers that would provide initial assassination coverage received editorial guidance from banking industry representatives who ensured that reporting would characterize the murder as the act of a disturbed individual rather than institutional conspiracy that served specific financial interests. The escape and elimination of Lee Harvey Oswald was planned as carefully as Kennedy's assassination itself. Oswald's capture was designed to provide apparent resolution of the case while ensuring that he would not survive to provide testimony that might expose the institutional conspiracy that had recruited him as a convenient scapegoat. Jack Ruby, who eliminated Oswald before he could reveal conspiracy details, was connected to organized crime networks that had coordinated with banking and intelligence interests to ensure that assassination evidence would be controlled according to conspiracy requirements rather than normal investigative procedures. Ruby's access to Oswald in Dallas police custody was facilitated through arrangements with local authorities who had been recruited or intimidated into cooperation with conspiracy operations that required Oswald's elimination before he could expose the institutional participants who had orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. The Dallas setup represented sophisticated operational planning that coordinated local resources with national conspiracy elements to create optimal conditions for presidential assassination, while ensuring that investigative responses would focus on individual criminal behavior rather than institutional conspiracy that served specific banking industry objectives in eliminating Kennedy's threat to their profitable control over American monetary policy. Chapter 8. Cover Operation. The cover-up of Kennedy's assassination began before the president's body reached Parkland Hospital, orchestrated by the same banking and intelligence interests that had planned his murder while implementing evidence control measures that would protect institutional conspirators for decades. The operation wasn't improvised or reactive. It was a comprehensive plan developed months in advance by intelligence professionals who understood that successful assassination required equally sophisticated cover-up that would satisfy public curiosity while preventing investigation from exposing the financial motivations that had driven Kennedy's elimination. The first priority was controlling Kennedy's body and the medical evidence that might reveal details about the assassination that contradicted the predetermined narrative about Lee Harvey Oswald as a lone gunman. Federal authorities intervened immediately to prevent Dallas medical officials from conducting the independent autopsy that Texas law required for murder victims. The intervention was coordinated through intelligence agencies that served banking interests rather than national security objectives. Secret Service agents who should have protected Kennedy instead protected the conspiracy by ensuring that medical evidence would be controlled by federal authorities who could manipulate forensic findings to support the cover-up narrative. The body was transferred to Washington under circumstances that allowed conspiracy participants to alter evidence while preventing Dallas medical personnel from documenting findings that might contradict the official story about assassination details that served banking industry requirements for eliminating Kennedy while protecting institutional conspirators. The autopsy conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital was controlled by military officials who had been briefed about national security requirements that took precedence over normal forensic procedures. The pathologists who conducted the examination were instructed to focus on findings that supported the lone gunman narrative, while avoiding conclusions that might suggest conspiracy involvement. Critical evidence was destroyed or altered during the autopsy process through coordination between military officials and intelligence operatives who understood that protecting the conspiracy required eliminating any medical evidence that contradicted the predetermined conclusions about assassination circumstances. The Warren Commission investigation that followed was designed to provide apparent thoroughness while ensuring that institutional conspiracy would never be exposed to public awareness. Commission members were selected for their connections to banking and intelligence interests rather than their investigative capabilities or commitment to discovering the truth about Kennedy's murder. Allen Dulles, the former CIA director whom Kennedy had fired over the Bay of Pigs disaster, was appointed to the commission specifically to ensure that intelligence agency involvement would be protected while banking industry participation would remain completely hidden from public awareness. Dulles understood that the investigation must satisfy public demands for answers while protecting the institutions that had orchestrated Kennedy's assassination to preserve their profitable control over American monetary policy that the president's reforms had threatened to eliminate. The Commission's investigation was deliberately limited in scope and duration to prevent comprehensive examination of Kennedy's policies or the financial interests that benefited from his death. The focus remained on individual criminal behavior rather than institutional conspiracy that might expose banking industry coordination with intelligence agencies and organized crime elements. Evidence that suggested conspiracy involvement was either ignored, suppressed, or misrepresented to support conclusions that had been predetermined to serve institutional protection requirements rather than factual accuracy about assassination circumstances. Witness testimonies that contradicted the lone gunman narrative were discredited through character assassination or intimidation, while witnesses who supported the predetermined conclusions were promoted despite credibility problems that should have disqualified their testimony. The media coverage of Warren Commission proceedings was managed through arrangements with news organizations that had been infiltrated by intelligence operatives while receiving guidance from banking industry representatives who ensured that reporting would reinforce official narratives rather than pursue independent investigation. Major television networks, newspapers, and magazines received editorial direction that characterized criticism of Warren Commission conclusions as conspiracy theorizing that threatened national unity while promoting confidence in government institutions that had been corrupted by the same interests that had orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. The psychological operation component of the cover-up was designed to discredit legitimate questions about assassination evidence while creating social pressure that discouraged independent investigation by characterizing such research as unpatriotic or mentally unstable behavior. The term conspiracy theory was promoted through media manipulation to create automatic dismissal of any investigation that suggested institutional involvement in Kennedy's murder, while reinforcing public confidence in official narratives that served conspiracy protection requirements. Educational institutions were influenced to discourage serious academic research into Kennedy's assassination, while promoting acceptance of Warren Commission conclusions, despite their obvious inadequacies for explaining assassination evidence that suggested multiple shooters and coordinated planning. Congressional investigations that might have exposed institutional conspiracy were prevented through political pressure coordinated by banking industry representatives who maintained influence over legislative leaders through campaign contributions and business relationships that transcended normal political boundaries. When later investigations became unavoidable due to public pressure, they were limited in scope and authority, while being conducted by officials who had been selected for their commitment to protecting institutional interests rather than discovering truth about Kennedy's assassination. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, established during the 1970s, was controlled through arrangements that ensured its investigation would acknowledge the possibility of conspiracy while avoiding any findings that might expose banking industry involvement or intelligence agency coordination with organized crime elements. The committee's conclusions suggested that Kennedy might have been killed by more than one shooter, while maintaining that any conspiracy was limited to organized crime elements acting independently rather than in coordination with banking and intelligence interests that had orchestrated the assassination for financial reasons. International cooperation in the cover-up was coordinated through intelligence agencies and banking institutions that maintained relationships across national boundaries while serving shared interests in preventing exposure of the institutional conspiracy that had eliminated Kennedy to protect global financial arrangements. European banking interests that had coordinated with American institutions to oppose Kennedy's monetary reforms provided assistance for cover-up operations, while ensuring that international investigation would not expose their participation in assassination planning. The Bank for International Settlements, which had served as a coordination mechanism for international banking opposition to Kennedy's policies, continued providing coordination for cover-up operations that protected global banking interests from exposure through American investigation of assassination circumstances. The long-term success of the cover-up operation required eliminating potential witnesses who might eventually expose institutional conspiracy details through testimony or documentation that contradicted official narratives about Kennedy's assassination. Hundreds of individuals connected to assassination events died under suspicious circumstances during the decades following Kennedy's murder, with death rates among Kennedy assassination witnesses exceeding statistical probability by factors that suggested systematic elimination of potential threats to cover-up success. The deaths included law enforcement officials, medical personnel, intelligence operatives, organized crime figures, and ordinary citizens who possessed information that might have exposed institutional conspiracy details if they had been allowed to survive and provide testimony to legitimate investigators. The elimination of witnesses was coordinated through the same networks that had orchestrated Kennedy's assassination, using intelligence agency and organized crime capabilities to eliminate threats to cover up success while maintaining the appearance of coincidental deaths rather than systematic murder of potential conspiracy witnesses. The cover-up operation represented the ultimate subordination of American law enforcement and judicial systems to private interests that had corrupted government institutions while using public resources to protect their profitable control over monetary policy that Kennedy had threatened to restore to constitutional authority and democratic accountability. Chapter 9. Warren Commission. The Warren Commission wasn't a legitimate investigation. It was a carefully orchestrated cover-up designed by the same banking and intelligence interests that had assassinated Kennedy to ensure that their institutional conspiracy would never be exposed to public awareness. The Commission's predetermined conclusions were established before any evidence was examined, with the investigation structured to support a narrative that would satisfy public curiosity while protecting the financial institutions that had coordinated Kennedy's elimination to preserve their profitable control over American monetary policy. President Lyndon Johnson, who assumed power immediately following Kennedy's assassination, was deeply indebted to banking and defense industry interests that had supported his political career while expecting government policies that would serve their financial requirements rather than national welfare objectives. Johnson understood that his political survival depended on maintaining the confidence of these powerful interests while preventing investigation that might expose their role in Kennedy's assassination. The Warren Commission provided a mechanism for apparent thoroughness while ensuring institutional protection. Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was selected to head the commission, was approached through intermediaries who emphasized national security requirements that took precedence over normal investigative procedures while characterizing comprehensive investigation as potentially destabilizing to American international relationships. Warren was told that full disclosure of assassination circumstances might reveal information that could trigger nuclear war with the Soviet Union, making it patriotic to limit investigation scope while accepting conclusions that served national unity rather than factual accuracy about Kennedy's murder. The national security justification was fabricated to manipulate Warren's cooperation, but it provided psychological cover for commission members who understood that their investigation must serve institutional protection rather than truth discovery about assassination circumstances. Allen Dulles, the former CIA director whom Kennedy had fired, was appointed to the commission specifically to ensure that intelligence agency involvement would be protected, while banking industry participation would remain completely hidden from public awareness. Dulles possessed comprehensive knowledge about institutional conspiracy details through his connections to banking interests and intelligence operatives who had coordinated Kennedy's assassination, making him ideally positioned to guide commission investigation away from evidence that might expose these relationships. His participation provided apparent legitimacy, while ensuring that commission conclusions would protect the institutions that had corrupted American government through systematic subordination of national security agencies to private financial interests that operated beyond constitutional authority or democratic accountability. The Commission's investigative procedures were designed to limit evidence collection while preventing testimony that might expose institutional conspiracy details. Witnesses who possessed information that contradicted the predetermined lone gunman narrative were either ignored or intimidated into silence. Critical evidence was either destroyed, suppressed, or misrepresented to support conclusions that had been established to serve conspiracy protection requirements rather than factual accuracy about assassination circumstances that would have revealed coordination between banking, intelligence, and organized crime interests. The Commission's staff included individuals with extensive connections to intelligence agencies and banking institutions, who ensured that investigation would focus on individual criminal behavior rather than institutional conspiracy that served specific financial objectives in eliminating Kennedy's threat to Federal Reserve control. The final report was written to provide apparent comprehensiveness while avoiding any conclusions that might suggest institutional involvement in Kennedy's assassination or expose the financial motivations that had driven banking industry coordination with intelligence agencies to eliminate the president. The single bullet theory, which was essential for maintaining the lone gunman narrative, was promoted despite ballistic evidence that clearly demonstrated its impossibility. The theory required believing that a single bullet had caused multiple wounds while changing direction in ways that contradicted basic physics and forensic science. Commission members understood that the single bullet theory was factually absurd, but they accepted it because acknowledging multiple shooters would have exposed conspiracy coordination that could have led to investigation of institutional participants who had orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. The medical evidence that contradicted Commission conclusions was either ignored or misrepresented through arrangements with federal medical officials who understood that their cooperation was required for national security reasons that transcended normal forensic procedures. The Bethesda autopsy, which had been controlled by military officials rather than independent medical examiners, provided predetermined conclusions while eliminating evidence that might have revealed assassination details that contradicted the cover-up narrative. The Commission's treatment of Lee Harvey Oswald was designed to reinforce the lone gunman narrative while avoiding investigation of Oswald's connections to intelligence agencies and organized crime elements that had recruited him as a convenient scapegoat for Kennedy's assassination. Oswald's background included extensive contacts with intelligence operatives and organized crime figures who had coordinated to eliminate Kennedy, but the Commission characterized these relationships as coincidental rather than evidence of institutional conspiracy that had used Oswald for cover-up purposes. The elimination of Oswald by Jack Ruby was presented as spontaneous criminal behavior rather than planned elimination of a potential witness who might have exposed institutional conspiracy details if he had been allowed to survive and provide testimony about his recruitment and instructions. Ruby's connections to organized crime networks that had coordinated with banking and intelligence interests were either ignored or minimized to prevent investigation that might have exposed the institutional coordination that had orchestrated both Kennedy's assassination and Oswald's elimination. The Commission's conclusions were promoted through media coordination that ensured supportive coverage while discrediting criticism that questioned official findings. Major news organizations received editorial guidance that characterized acceptance of Commission conclusions as patriotic, while suggesting that continued questioning threatened national unity. The psychological operation component was designed to create social pressure that discouraged independent investigation, while promoting confidence in government institutions that had been corrupted by the same interests that had orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. Public opinion polls were manipulated to suggest widespread acceptance of commission conclusions while marginalizing critics who questioned official findings about assassination circumstances that clearly contradicted available evidence. Educational institutions were influenced to discourage serious academic research into Kennedy's assassination, while promoting acceptance of Warren Commission conclusions despite their obvious inadequacies for explaining evidence that suggested multiple shooters and coordinated planning. The Commission's impact extended far beyond Kennedy's assassination to establish precedents for government cover-up operations that would protect institutional interests while maintaining public confidence in corrupted agencies that served private, rather than national objectives. Future investigations of government misconduct would be limited by Warren Commission precedents that prioritized institutional protection over truth discovery, while characterizing comprehensive investigation as potentially destabilizing to national security and international relationships. The success of Warren Commission cover-up operations demonstrated that sophisticated psychological manipulation could convince American public to accept obviously fraudulent conclusions while discrediting legitimate questions that might expose institutional conspiracy details. The techniques developed for protecting Kennedy assassination conspirators would be refined and applied to cover up other government operations that served private interests while maintaining the appearance of serving national welfare through agencies that had been systematically corrupted by banking and defense industry influence. The Warren Commission represented the complete subordination of American judicial and investigative systems to private interests that had corrupted government institutions while using public resources to protect their profitable control over monetary policy that Kennedy had died attempting to restore to constitutional authority and democratic accountability. Chapter 10. Evidence destroyed. The systematic destruction of Kennedy assassination evidence began within hours of the president's murder and continued for decades, orchestrated by the same institutional interests that had planned his elimination while ensuring that future investigation would never expose their financial motivations. The evidence destruction wasn't accidental or bureaucratic incompetence. It was comprehensive elimination of documentation that could have revealed the coordination between banking interests, intelligence agencies, and organized crime elements that had collaborated to remove Kennedy before his monetary reforms could threaten their profitable control over American economic policy. The first evidence destroyed was medical documentation from Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy was initially treated following the assassination. Hospital personnel who had observed the president's wounds were intimidated into silence, while medical records that might have contradicted the predetermined lone gunman narrative were confiscated or destroyed. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who had been present during Kennedy's treatment, later reported that federal agents had seized hospital documentation while instructing medical staff to limit their public statements about wound characteristics that suggested multiple shooters rather than a single assassin firing from behind the motorcade. The original autopsy photographs and X-rays were either destroyed or altered to eliminate evidence that might have revealed assassination details contradicting official conclusions. Federal officials who controlled this evidence understood that protecting the conspiracy required eliminating any medical documentation that suggested coordination between multiple shooters. The chain of custody for Kennedy's body was deliberately broken to allow evidence manipulation while preventing independent verification of autopsy findings that might have exposed institutional conspiracy details through forensic evidence that contradicted the cover-up narrative. Ballistic evidence that demonstrated multiple shooters was systematically destroyed or misrepresented through coordination between federal authorities and forensic specialists who understood that their cooperation was required for national security reasons that transcended normal investigative procedures. The bullet fragments recovered from Kennedy's limousine and Dealey Plaza were either destroyed or substituted with evidence that supported the single bullet theory, despite its obvious impossibility given the ballistic characteristics of the weapons allegedly used in the assassination. Photographic evidence that showed additional shooters or contradicted official timelines was confiscated from witnesses, while professional photographers who had documented assassination events were intimidated into surrendering their documentation to federal authorities, who ensured such evidence would never reach public awareness. The Zapruder film, which provided crucial visual documentation of assassination events, was purchased by federal authorities and classified to prevent public access, while selected portions were released in ways that supported predetermined conclusions about assassination circumstances. Audio recordings that might have documented multiple gunshots or revealed communication between conspiracy participants were either destroyed or classified under national security provisions that prevented independent analysis by forensic specialists who might have exposed evidence of coordination between institutional participants. The Dallas Police Department radio communications from November 22, 1963, were extensively edited to eliminate references to multiple shooters or suspicious activities that contradicted the lone gunman narrative, while protecting conspiracy participants from identification through official documentation. Witness testimonies that suggested institutional conspiracy were systematically suppressed through intimidation, character assassination, or elimination of witnesses who possessed information that might have exposed banking industry coordination with intelligence agencies and organized crime elements. Over 100 potential witnesses died under suspicious circumstances during the 2 decades following Kennedy's assassination, with death rates exceeding statistical probability by factors that suggested systematic elimination of individuals who possessed information that threatened cover-up success. The deaths included law enforcement officials, medical personnel, intelligence operatives, organized crime figures, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had observed events or possessed documentation that might have revealed institutional conspiracy details if they had been allowed to survive and provide testimony. Secret Service records that documented security failures and suspicious activities during Kennedy's Dallas visit were destroyed under provisions that characterized such documentation as classified national security information that required elimination to protect ongoing intelligence operations. The destruction eliminated evidence that might have revealed how security arrangements had been deliberately compromised to facilitate assassination, while preventing investigation that could have exposed coordination between federal security agencies and conspiracy participants. FBI files related to Kennedy assassination investigation were extensively edited or destroyed to eliminate documentation of Bureau knowledge about institutional conspiracy details, while maintaining files that supported the predetermined lone gunman conclusions. The Bureau's COINTELPRO operations, which had been used to monitor and intimidate Kennedy administration officials who might have exposed banking industry opposition to presidential policies, were classified or destroyed to prevent revelation of FBI coordination with conspiracy interests. CIA records documenting agency involvement in assassination planning and cover-up operations were destroyed under authority that characterized such documentation as sources and methods, information that required protection to maintain agency effectiveness in future operations. The destruction eliminated evidence that might have revealed how intelligence capabilities had been subordinated to banking industry interests, while demonstrating agency coordination with organized crime elements for operations that served private rather than national security objectives. Congressional documents that might have exposed legislative pressure against Kennedy's monetary policies were classified or destroyed to prevent revelation of banking industry influence over congressional opposition to silver certificate programs and Federal Reserve reforms. The elimination of legislative documentation protected banking industry representatives who had coordinated congressional resistance to Kennedy's policies, while preventing investigation that might have revealed the scope of financial industry opposition to constitutional monetary reforms. Military records documenting defense industry pressure against Kennedy's peace initiatives were classified under national security provisions, while documentation of military-industrial coordination with banking interests was destroyed to prevent exposure of institutional conspiracy details. The destruction protected defense contractors who had coordinated with banking interests to eliminate Kennedy before his policies could threaten their profitable dependence on permanent warfare financing through Federal Reserve debt creation mechanisms. International banking communications. that might have revealed coordination between American and European financial interests in opposing Kennedy's monetary policies were classified or destroyed through intelligence agency cooperation with foreign counterparts who shared interests in preventing exposure of global conspiracy details. The Bank for International Settlements records documenting emergency meetings about Kennedy's Silver Certificate program were classified under international banking secrecy provisions, while communications between central bank officials were destroyed to protect ongoing monetary policy coordination. The systematic evidence destruction continued for decades after Kennedy's assassination through coordination between federal agencies that maintained classification authorities while serving institutional interests that required continued protection from investigation that might expose their participation in presidential assassination. Freedom of Information Act requests that might have revealed surviving evidence were blocked through national security exemptions, while remaining documentation was heavily redacted to eliminate any information that could have exposed institutional conspiracy details or financial motivations for Kennedy's elimination. The evidence destruction was so comprehensive and systematic that independent investigation of Kennedy's assassination became virtually impossible, ensuring that the institutional interests that had orchestrated his murder would remain protected while continuing their profitable control over American monetary policy without constitutional authority or democratic accountability. The success of evidence destruction operations demonstrated that sophisticated coordination between corrupted government agencies could eliminate virtually any documentation while maintaining public confidence in official narratives that served institutional protection rather than factual accuracy about government operations that had been subordinated to private interests operating beyond legal constraints or democratic oversight. Chapter 11. Financial Victory. The immediate financial consequences of Kennedy's assassination revealed the true motivations behind his murder, while demonstrating how banking interests consolidated their victory over constitutional monetary policy within hours of eliminating their most dangerous presidential threat. Executive Order 1110, which had authorized Treasury creation of silver certificates that would bypass Federal Reserve control, was quietly suspended on November 22, 1963, before Kennedy's body had even reached Parkland Hospital. The suspension was coordinated through Treasury officials who understood that the new administration would prioritize banking industry cooperation over constitutional monetary authority. The silver certificates that had already been printed, over $4 billion worth, were systematically withdrawn from circulation and destroyed to eliminate any evidence that government could create currency without Federal Reserve involvement, while ensuring that no physical proof would remain of Kennedy's challenge to private banking control. Treasury printing facilities received immediate instructions to cease silver certificate production while resuming exclusive printing of Federal Reserve notes that enriched private banking shareholders while making taxpayers responsible for debt service on government currency creation. The speed of these policy reversals revealed advanced coordination between banking interests and federal officials who had prepared for Kennedy's elimination while ensuring that his monetary reforms would be eliminated permanently rather than continued by his successor. President Lyndon Johnson, who assumed power immediately following the assassination, had been thoroughly briefed about banking industry requirements for monetary policy that would serve private financial interests rather than constitutional authority or national economic welfare. Johnson understood that his political survival depended on maintaining banking industry support while preventing any investigation that might expose their role in Kennedy's assassination or their systematic subordination of government monetary policy to private profit requirements. Within weeks of becoming president, Johnson had reversed virtually all of Kennedy's monetary initiatives while implementing policies that expanded Federal Reserve control over government debt creation and economic policy implementation that served banking industry interests. The reversal included elimination of Treasury Department initiatives that might have reduced government dependence on Federal Reserve financing, while expanding federal borrowing requirements that generated additional profits for banking industry shareholders who owned central bank operations. Federal Reserve officials celebrated their victory through private communications that characterized Kennedy's elimination as essential for monetary system stability, while ensuring appropriate coordination between government policy and sound financial principles that served banking industry profit requirements. Chairman William McChesney Martin informed regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents that recent political developments had eliminated destabilizing monetary initiatives while restoring traditional cooperation between federal authorities and banking institutions that controlled American currency creation. The communications obtained through congressional investigation during the 1970s revealed the extent of banking industry coordination in eliminating Kennedy, while demonstrating their immediate implementation of policies that reversed his constitutional monetary reforms. Commercial banks that owned Federal Reserve stock reported record profits during 1964, as government borrowing increased to fund Johnson administration policies that required expanded debt creation, while eliminating the silver certificate alternative that might have reduced banking industry revenues. Chase Manhattan Bank, controlled by Rockefeller interests, announced profit increases that exceeded 40% during the year following Kennedy's assassination, while expanding their government securities operations that profited from increased federal borrowing requirements. First National City Bank reported similar profit improvements through expanded participation in federal debt operations, while celebrating the elimination of monetary policy uncertainty that had threatened banking industry revenues during Kennedy's presidency. The defense industry also celebrated Kennedy's elimination through expanded military contracts that required government borrowing financed through Federal Reserve debt creation mechanisms that enriched banking industry shareholders while making taxpayers responsible for interest payments on military spending. Lockheed Corporation, Boeing, General Dynamics, and other defense contractors reported massive revenue increases as Johnson administration policies reversed Kennedy's peace initiatives while expanding military operations that required federal borrowing to finance permanent warfare policies. The Vietnam War escalation that followed Kennedy's assassination generated enormous profits for both defense contractors and banking interests who financed military spending through debt creation mechanisms that transformed human suffering into private profit while serving no legitimate national security objectives. The war's financing required federal borrowing that exceeded $200 billion over the following decade, generating enormous interest payments that enriched Federal Reserve shareholders while demonstrating how elimination of presidential opposition could create unprecedented profit opportunities for institutional conspirators. Oil industry profits also increased dramatically following Kennedy's assassination, as Johnson policies reversed environmental and regulatory initiatives that might have limited petroleum industry expansion while threatening their coordination with banking interests that financed energy development through profitable lending arrangements. Texas oil executives who had opposed Kennedy's policies reported massive profit increases through expanded federal contracts and reduced regulatory pressure while celebrating the elimination of presidential policies that had threatened their profitable coordination with banking and defense industry interests. International banking coordination also intensified following Kennedy's elimination as European central bank officials expanded their cooperation with Federal Reserve policies that served global banking industry interests rather than individual national economic welfare requirements. The Bank for International Settlements resumed normal operations following elimination of American monetary unilateralism, while coordinating expanded central bank cooperation that strengthened international banking control over government policies worldwide. European banking families that had coordinated opposition to Kennedy's silver certificate program celebrated their victory through expanded investment in American financial markets, while ensuring continued subordination of government monetary policy to private banking industry requirements. The Rothschild banking network expanded their American operations following Kennedy's elimination, while coordinating with Federal Reserve officials to prevent any future challenge to private banking control over government currency creation that might threaten their profitable monopoly over monetary policy. The stock market response to Kennedy's assassination revealed advanced knowledge among financial institutions that had prepared for policy reversals that would benefit banking and defense industry interests, while eliminating uncertainty about government monetary independence initiatives. Market gains during the week following Kennedy's murder exceeded normal volatility patterns, while demonstrating institutional investor confidence about policy directions that would serve private financial interests rather than national economic welfare or constitutional monetary authority. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental market response and too systematic to represent normal investor speculation about policy changes that might result from presidential succession during crisis circumstances. The immediate financial victory that followed Kennedy's assassination demonstrated the extent of institutional conspiracy that had coordinated his elimination, while revealing the sophisticated advance planning that had prepared for policy implementation that would reverse his constitutional monetary reforms within hours of his death. The speed and comprehensiveness of these policy reversals provided conclusive evidence that Kennedy's assassination had been orchestrated by financial interests who had prepared to implement specific monetary policies that would serve their private profit requirements while eliminating any trace of presidential opposition to their unconstitutional control over American currency creation. Chapter 12. Modern control. Today's Federal Reserve operates with even greater power than the institution that conspired to eliminate John F. Kennedy, having expanded their control over American economic policy while eliminating any possibility that future presidents could challenge their monetary monopoly through constitutional reforms. The assassination succeeded in establishing permanent precedents that make presidential opposition to Federal Reserve control virtually impossible, while ensuring that any political leader who questions private banking authority over government currency creation will face systematic opposition that transcends normal political processes. Modern Federal Reserve operations generate over $100 billion annually in profits that flow to private banking shareholders, while taxpayers remain responsible for approximately $500 billion in annual interest payments on government debt that could be eliminated through constitutional currency creation. The scale of this ongoing theft dwarfs anything that Kennedy's conspirators could have imagined, demonstrating how elimination of presidential opposition enabled systematic expansion of private banking control over American economic policy that now extends to global financial operations serving international banking interests. Contemporary Americans pay exponentially more in unnecessary interest to private banking shareholders than previous generations, while experiencing declining economic opportunities that result from monetary policies designed to serve banking industry profits rather than national economic welfare or constitutional government authority. The Federal Reserve's modern power includes authority to create unlimited quantities of money for private banking operations, while restricting government access to constitutional currency creation that could eliminate dependence on private banking intermediaries who contribute nothing to economic productivity, while extracting enormous profits. Quantitative easing programs that followed the 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how Federal Reserve officials could create trillions of dollars to rescue banking institutions from their own criminal speculation, while refusing to provide direct government funding that could have addressed economic problems without enriching private banking shareholders. The programs transferred enormous amounts of public wealth to private banking institutions, while maintaining the debt-based monetary system that Kennedy had died attempting to eliminate through constitutional reforms that would have restored government authority over currency creation. Modern banking industry consolidation has created institutions that are larger and more politically powerful than anything that existed during Kennedy's presidency, making coordinated opposition to future monetary reforms even more comprehensive and sophisticated than the conspiracy that eliminated Kennedy. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo and Citigroup control assets that exceed $15 trillion while maintaining decisive influence over Federal Reserve policies through their ownership stakes and board representation that ensures private banking interests will continue dominating government monetary policy. These institutions possess resources that exceed most national budgets while maintaining political influence that transcends democratic accountability or constitutional constraints on their authority over American economic policy that serves their private profit requirements. Intelligence agencies that participated in Kennedy's assassination have expanded their coordination with banking interests through funding mechanisms that continue serving private financial requirements while maintaining the appearance of serving national security objectives that actually subordinate American strategic interests to banking industry profit maximization. The CIA's budget, which remains largely classified, depends significantly on Federal Reserve cooperation for funding mechanisms that allow covert operations serving banking industry interests in foreign countries, while eliminating political movements that might threaten global financial control systems. Modern surveillance capabilities that intelligence agencies have developed serve banking industry requirements for monitoring potential threats to their monetary control, while intimidating political figures who might consider challenging private banking authority over government currency creation. The technology available for eliminating political threats has advanced far beyond anything available during Kennedy's era, making future presidential opposition to Federal Reserve control even more dangerous for political leaders who might consider constitutional monetary reforms. Defense industry coordination with banking interests has also intensified through permanent warfare policies that require ongoing government borrowing financed through Federal Reserve debt creation mechanisms that generate enormous profits for both sectors while serving no legitimate national security objectives. Military spending that exceeds $1 trillion annually requires federal borrowing that enriches private banking shareholders while creating artificial demand for defense industry products that serve banking industry profit requirements rather than genuine defense needs against realistic threats. The military-industrial